Hello, hello, it's Blue coming to you live from the Swiss Alps as I travel with the Von Trapp family. And today we have the final Top Cut talk of Season 1. And what better way to wrap up Season 1 than with the champion in the recent 100 player online event, the Kelon Guy. The AWOL Invitational was a 7 round Swiss, followed by a top cut where only the best of the Altered Weekly Online League were invited. And our guest not only won, but went undefeated the entire way. Come listen to his hot takes on the best decks for the Season 1 meta, where he comes up with his crazy decks, and how we are so close to getting a Arjun deck in the Invitational. I hope everyone enjoys this final video of Season 1, and thank you so much for your support, especially for my Trial by Frost card reveal video, as we work to grow the Altered TCG community. Psst. Bonus points to anyone who makes it to the end of the video where I'll do a giveaway if you answer a question in the comments. And now I'll send you to myself to start off the interview. And hello to everyone watching. We have a special guest with us today. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell me a bit how you got into Altered?
Hello, I'm TheKelonGuy, and I'm a competitive Altered player from Switzerland. And I occasionally also make YouTube videos on my YouTube channel with the same name, KelonGuy. And how I got into Altered, I heard of Altered during the Kickstarter, but I didn't really look any further into it at that point until the release of the game. But I was a long-time Magic the Gathering player, and when a friend from my Magic the Gathering group asked if we were interested in trying out Altered, I looked a little bit further into it, was super interested in trying the game really casually. And I think about within 5 minutes of playing with just starter decks, I was super hooked because the depth of decision making options was really, really strong. And I loved the idea of playing on two boards at once with the two sides, two expeditions, hero and companion, and the different factions as well, and I was completely unable to figure out my favorite of those factions. But from that point on, I was pretty much sold. I, on the spot, pretty much just entirely dropped Magic and all of my other games, and I haven't really looked back since.
Yeah, I mean, actually, what everyone's seeing now, as far as like your pretty picture that I have set up on the screen, I was able to internet sleuth a little bit, and I noticed that the last bit of gameplay is somewhere around like July of last year, so that kind of lines up with exactly what you're saying.
That's true. If there's anyone out there who recognizes my Discord username or Twitch usernames and has played EVE Online, you may or may not have heard of me from there. I've played a good bit of that game. It's one of my favorite games that I've ever played in general. I think, and to an extent, it's a MMO that's really well known for being like spreadsheets in space. And that spreadsheet thing, I think, has helped me a little bit with Altered because I keep a lot of track of like matchups and opponents that I've played against already on Board Game Arena. And definitely that background has helped me a little bit there, I'd say. But I've done commentary for that game as well, for the company, for one of their biggest tournaments. So I definitely love that game, but I definitely have not been super engaged, especially since starting Altered.
Yeah, it seems like it's always hard to like keep up with a variety of different things that you're interested in, especially when you get really invested in it. Like, I mean, I still do other stuff on occasion, but not nearly as much as I used to, and I don't know. I mean, it's the same reason why I have like hundreds of games on my Steam that I still haven't played because I just get too focused on certain things. But I can relate a lot. But you know what? Back to a little bit of more altered stuff. So the AWOL Season 1 Invitational, essentially the championship for AWOL this season, also known as the Altered Weekly Online League, just so in case anyone doesn't know what AWOL stands for, was the second largest online event recorded at this point, based off of 39 cards. Shout
Hmm.
out to Tom there. As far as actual people participating, I think there is like a little bit more set up, other than the 100 participants that actually played. But uh, getting that 100-person marker is pretty big, I'd have to imagine.
Hmm.
And you've been a bit of an online warrior, joining couple of last minute, just about every event, whether it was set up for NA or EU time zones, ruining your sleep schedule, all that good stuff. But what was this experience like in comparison to the many other events you have been in with, I mean, realistically, a larger number of players, 7 rounds of Swiss, and even a top cut setup?
Yeah, you're right. I play in a lot of events, and typically, like familiarity with tournament play would help a lot to calm tournament nerves that a lot of people have, and that's myself included. I also don't really put too much stock in ladder rankings. I, for the most part, take like prior tournament results as being a better indication of like being a really skilled player. In this case, for the event, I had done so much advanced prep to the point of I actually stressed myself out about it, which was the exact opposite of that tournament familiarity helping out sort of dynamic. I really, really wanted to perform well in something that I expected to be such a competitive event, it being the invitational of people who have already performed well in the AWOL events, and AWOL sort of being the premier online event that's been going on ever since the game released, really, and I put a ton of practice and effort into it. So I really wanted to do well. As far as, yeah, 7 rounds of Swiss like that, I consider myself a bit of a best of one specialist. I don't really like best of three so much in Altered, and I also am a bit, I would say, a bit of an emotional player even. So if I'm frustrated or tilted, I don't play nearly as well. And so I was primarily just concerned about killing it for the Swiss rounds when I would be guaranteed to be playing best of one. Um, but compared to any other tournament that I've played as of yet, including some of the larger or more serious ones like Exalts, at least for me, the matchups that I had were quite literally only the most competitive decks of the highest level at the moment that my opponents were on. So after starting out the first couple rounds with wins against really solid players on decks like Sigismar, for example, I could tell that I was playing really well. So I just focused in on continuing to perform at that same level, and that I think mindset really carried me through the day with the undefeated record through Swiss. Top Cut then got a really happy surprise from Simon that we could vote on whether we preferred best of one or best of three. And as soon as it was announced that we could be playing best of one, in that moment, I actually sort of felt favored to win the whole thing. So that was really awesome. And sure enough, I won out from there pretty smoothly as well.
Nice. Yeah, and just kind of like going into like your background a little bit as far as Magic is
Mhm.
concerned. Have you done very many like tournaments associated with Magic, whether that be online or in person, that kind of like related to your current experience with Altered?
Definitely. For those who are really familiar with Magic, the format that I played the most of was Legacy, which is a much older format of Magic. It's well known for really complicated game states, or like even as soon as the first turns of the game, like anything could end pretty much at any moment. So you have to be playing on the ball all the time. I definitely loved playing tournaments for that format. However, I would say, especially in recent years, like prices have skyrocketed with Magic cards, and so those sort of competitive events are fewer and far between. So yeah, I would say that I definitely have a lot of tournament experience from Magic, but just not recently, especially, and especially since COVID times, that really changed all those dynamics. But yeah, I've played in some really large events like Grand Prix for that game with a couple thousand players even. But for the most part with that game, I honestly never really picked decks that I think were competitive enough to win those events even. I would play decks that I thought were good or had a lot of nuance or complicated situations that I could do really cool things with. But oftentimes I would simply just lose to the best deck in the room and have a very much like, well, nothing I could do about that sort of attitude to it, which was true, but I wasn't really setting myself up for success either. So I had some good finishes, but nothing this spectacular, I guess.
Yeah, I gotcha. Yeah, I was just curious because it seems like there's a good amount of altered players that have had some backgrounds in competitive of whatever
Mhm,
card games or anything. So, was just curious about that. But yeah, I
mm,
mean, as an avid participant in these online events, I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts and ideas, or maybe not, about the variety of events you have participated in.
mhm,
What are some updates or changes you would like to see for future online events in particular?
mhm. Um, Well, I love pretty much all of the events and different formats that people are making for these events and coming up with and creating little communities around. But I also organize my own tournament series, the Kelon Guys Biweekly or KGB. And I think one of my own most successful concepts that I really hope other tournaments will pick up on a little bit was awarding a player each week or each every other week, I guess, with my with my biweekly tournament, is awarding a player a prize for innovating via their deck or card choice and that sort of thing. I know AWOL did that at least 1 week for the top finisher of each faction, which was super awesome. Ace does often a gold star that Kohlrabi awards for random funny things as well. And I like these sort of things that can make like competitive altered interesting still for brewers or people who just don't want to be on one of the most high powered heroes at every moment. Um, but otherwise, I would say I would really hope that Equinox will also step up a bit on helping out online tournaments, whether that means either just some extra advertising for them via whatever platforms they have or overall acknowledgement. I totally get it. I'm fine with the fact that online events don't necessarily reward like adventure pass levels, for example. And I respect the idea of them wanting to get players out into in person events. But there are so many places in the world without a local game store to play at or easy access to one at the moment for Altered specifically. So these online events are in many cases what are keeping competitive players invested. So I'd really hope that there could be some additional engagement there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think one thing that I've always looked at in particular is since Altered is so unique in the online arena of
Mm.
TCGs, I think there has to be ways that you can set up some version of organized play associated with online play
Hmm.
that may not interfere with the goals that they have as far as in-person play.
Hmm.
What that is up for debate and what they would be willing to do, but I think it would definitely be super beneficial in the long run. But yeah, it's interesting to hear your thoughts on that, and also your thoughts on the general uniqueness of different decks and stuff, because that kind of goes
Hmm.
into my next question. Um, as far as other than being notoriously a last minute joiner to events, you've been known to be quite the chef when it comes to cooking up random decks for a lot of these events. And other than just the AWOL event, you can go into
Hmm.
your reasoning behind that. But what made you choose the hero and deck list that you brought to the AWOL Invitational that eventually led to the championship?
Yeah, well, for the most part, I would say that it hasn't really been random decks that I've been cooking on, but definitely things that I thought there was a lot of hope with or weren't entirely figured out yet. And I've definitely always been looking at things that can really strike at a metagame that I think is pretty accurate for what I would expect from a tournament. But as I mentioned before, I had a really hard time from day one with figuring out my favorite faction. So I sort of wanted to make that lack of faction certainty work out for me. So early on into the game, I was playing Traced. I got frustrated losing to Waru every single game, like 15 games against Waru, lost every single one of them. And I quickly picked up that deck because it was the most competitive, at least in that moment for me. And I was picking it up in the most like Robin Hood abusing configuration possible. But ever since just before the Robin nerf, I've been really bouncing about, letting myself explore different heroes. Back then, it was things like Nevenka that I was exploring as well, which actually had a pretty good matchup into Waru. But while I think I'm good at deck brewing, I think I'm much better at optimizing than I am brewing. There were a few decks that I felt I could play at a competitive level without feeling at all dead to the metagame that I expected, at least for the AWOL event, at least as of 2 weeks before. So I was looking at three. I was looking at Argent Festival, which I had crafted together with an amazingly innovative Spanish player, Darklight. Then there was Foundryless Kojo. So just Kojo with Havens, but no Foundries, which I had helped my teammate Freeloader optimize over the weeks before that. And then Aphanis I had had as a backup deck even from the Waru days as well. And so, of course, there the basic lists for Aphanis were largely inspired by the Skycryer's finish in Angers at the really large event there. But as I do with virtually every really well-known deck in the metagame, I like to go through those decks' top players' match histories on Board Game Arena to try to pick up on play patterns and deck list configurations, that sort of thing. And I was really impressed with Yo2137 or Anthony on Discord. His play and deck configurations were awesome with Afanas. So about 2 weeks before the event, I picked up my second unique for the deck, and I was pretty much locked in from then. Arjun, I chose to rule out because the deck struggles in events where more than a single loss can take you out of the running. And it was looking like this event would likely be the case that you could only lose a single game in order to make top eight still. And that deck does have a really high win rate, but it will, at some point during an event that's at least 7 rounds, it will lose to itself at least once. And then Kojo can really struggle with the Afanas matchup, I find specifically. But both of those decks I was also very close to bringing for the event. And then a big leg up I had, I think, on other Afanas players was that I had spent a lot of time playing that deck without having had a full loadout of really insane uniques. And that can really help if you're trying to get a better appreciation for the times that having really good uniques will be good, how to use them more optimally, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting as far as like your different influences and different things that you're mentioning. I do like your Argent deck. I've seen it played before. I've seen people get really salty losing to it before.
It's true.
Um, but probably the best decision overall, especially in this type of event where you know you're going to deal with at least somewhat top tier decks and players that have done well in events or at least well
Mhm.
enough, right? And 7 rounds of play on top of a top cut and so on and so forth kind of thing. It feels like it would eventually hit some type of brick or snag, which you did
It's
mention overall.
true.
So
It's there yeah, it's one of these cases as well where I think most players have sort of been putting together their own, like, internal tier list of popular decks. And for me personally, I was pretty sure that for me, the top decks that I was worried about for the event or that I knew I would have to be thinking about were Afanas, Sigismar, Traced, Tasia, and Kojo. And Afanas was the one deck that I felt like I could get a favorable matchup if I was playing well in all of those matchups. And then the Afanas Mirror, if I'm playing a little bit better, then I can win. So I think that was probably the most critical thing coming down to it at the very end. I think that actually that yeah, Arjun likely did have a favorable matchup against most of those. Afanas is a bit iffy, but otherwise, I do think that that deck was pretty competitive there. It's just how in an event like that where yeah, one loss is all you get before you're getting knocked out of the event if you lose again. How much am I willing to potentially just lose to myself not finding like a festival in the top 25 or something?
yeah, for sure. And I'm always a big fan of Kojo too, but
Yeah, Kojo is excellent.
Bravos has its problems occasionally too, so
Mhm,
I can't blame you there. And but yeah, I mean, getting into more of the Afanis, I think
mhm,
it's always been a solid deck from the very beginning, which you mentioned with Skycrier,
yep,
bringing it to that first 1,000 player plus event and everything and doing well.
mhm.
Um, but there are a lot of like subtle variations with different cards to include from like rare setup and
Oh, yeah.
commons and whatever it may be. But one thing you did mention was as far as your uniques are concerned, they
Mhm.
aren't the typical at dusk spindle harvesters that you see a lot of in Afanis decks. Um, was there a specific reason behind that other than not wanting to pay a couple thousand on the community marketplace? Or what was the thought process behind those uniques and what you
So
had for that deck?
yeah, actually, that's a at dusk spindles, yeah, that's a heck, that could be a topic for its own 30-minute video, right? No, actually, I might make a video on that at some point soon. That's a really interesting one. No, in this case, I would absolutely be lying if I said that it was purely a choice based on what I think is the absolute best. No, that was absolutely an accessibility question. But it also comes from the beginning when I was figuring out like what my end goal Afanas list would look like. I myself opened a cool Spindle Harvester unique. If you've seen my deck list, it's the 1/1. The other two I did get off of Marketplace, but the 1/1 Spindle Harvesters I play with, it's a leave the expedition zone. If I have one or more boosts, you may return a card other than me from your reserve to your hand. And it comes with a stat point as well, which is great. But playing Afanas with that and then comparing it to the other like higher cost spell return uniques that I had had access to previously, It's night and day different, but I think I really learned as well how to optimize those situations where that leaves the expedition zone thing can be incredibly relevant. There's also times when it has actually a lot of fringe upside, even in comparison to at dusks. Yeah, that's pretty much that dynamic that I might get into further at some point, but I would say for the time being, like I'm really happy with the uniques I have. They're all individually awesome. They all have fringe synergy with other cards in the deck, and I really configured my list around it in order to make like optimal use of them where possible. And in games as well, I would say I'm really leveraging the fact that, for example, in some matchups, it will be sort of an upside that it's not an at dusk effect. Like my Sigismar opponent can't teamwork training my Spindle Harvesters after it has a boost to prevent me from looping a Beauty Sleep, for example. They don't get that anymore. So there are a lot of times when it's actually incredibly strong to have uniques like that, and getting them at a super discount in comparison to the crazy at dusks or whatever. Like there's definitely some crazy deals that people can still be snagging on whatever market stuff they have access to.
Yeah, for sure. I'm still a little bit salty recently from OP Pack. One of my friends at a local got of a 1/1 spindle at dusk.
Mhm.
So, especially since he was going to trade the OP pack with me from the one that
Oh,
I had too, and so I'm like,
ouch.
what are you going to do? I mean, I don't play a lot of Afanis either way, but
Mhm.
it's all good. I'm not too salty, but, yeah, I mean, speaking of, like, just general influences that you mentioned earlier about, like, different deck lists that you're setting up and just testing decks in general,
Mhm.
I think we even spoke about it a little bit on a cast we did together where I was able to actually pull you away from playing for at least 1 tournament in a week.
Mhm.
Um, but, this invitational tournament was also your first time you officially represented your secret or not so secret team. Can you tell us a bit about the team you were involved in and how that's helped you get where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So wasn't so much of a secret. It was more that we just weren't really publicly saying anything about it. We were just, it was theoretically a thing in the background. But I founded AQZ, or Altered Quarantine Zone, with a couple buddies as a well back after week 2 of Ace and AWOL, I think it was even. That was along with then Pluka of ladder and tournament fame at that point, and then my buddy Freeloader as well, who's local here, and then as well as a couple friends of Pluka's, and we went on from there to have sort of an insane tournament run in that early altered time. But for the most part, things weren't like super active as a team, and then especially after Robin got nerfed. But overall, I would definitely say working together with others with a high standard of competitive play can help your own gameplay and mindset. Watching replays of your buddies, that's super helpful. That sort of thing, and then having people to test with. It's awesome. And we originally started the team with some competitive goals. So once things started getting announced for organized play in this year, 2025, we really started trying to bring things back to life. We brought in Pandy Andy, who wanted to transition more towards playing rather than commentating, but also really loves the idea of pushing a team or group. And we brought in Runefolk, who is a super innovative and incredibly active competitive player as well. So at the moment, things are really active. We're cooking up things. We've been running practice games, so it's pretty great.
Yeah, nice. I mean, all great folks that you mentioned. I have noticed on the BGA ladders, Pluka being revived and playing a few different games.
Yes.
Haven't played him myself, but I played people that have played him when I was like looking at other people that I've was playing against, and then I was like, oh look, they played Pluka their last game or whatever it was. So it was interesting to see. But nice that you guys are getting back at it, and we have another team within the altered space that are going to add to the competitive environment a little bit.
Hmm.
But yeah, speaking of competitive and getting into the game specifically as far as the AWOL Invitational is concerned, was there any particularly difficult matches you encountered making your way through the Swiss rounds or even in the top cut?
Yeah, that's a great question. The one deck that I had honestly felt like I hadn't had enough time or reps preparing against, largely because I couldn't find a practice partner for that matchup specifically at that point, was Nevenka. and I was really worried about the chance of potentially running into a Navenka, that being a very aggressive deck that also can play Small Step Giant Leap. So the typical Afana strategy of just match your opponent and then win would not necessarily work in that matchup. So although I definitely think it is probably a favorable matchup for Afanas, I hadn't really had the reps that I wanted to have against it. As far as the games that I did have that ended up being really difficult, I know in round 6 of the Swiss, I played against another Afanas player in a mirror. It was Nayete, and I was pretty much behind like 3 or 4 expeditions from pretty much right early on into the game. I drew my uniques, but oftentimes opening with uniques in Afanas mirrors is actually sometimes not really optimal, especially if you're playing cards that don't really matter and they're barely outstatting you, and you're looping things that don't really matter, but they're playing Katagir and Mage Dancers, for example. So I fell behind really hard early. And so from there, I was just trying to claw my way back through it, like not tilt out, not be like, my draws have been bad. I was really focused a lot on like what is left in my deck in what quantities that isn't going to be left in my opponent's deck in those quantities, and then just play to my outs there. And that ended up in a super close arena where I won by a single stat point because I had managed to put boosts like correctly, spread things across the entire team of characters that I had on board to avoid losing to removal. So I won by a single stat point in arena. That was incredibly close. Otherwise, though, I mean, a ton of competitive matchups. I played against a lot of Sigismar. I played against Traced. I ran into my teammate Freeloader in round 4 in the undefeated bracket, who was on Kojo. Um, and then my finals opponent of the tournament for Nico was on Tasia, and he was also the undefeated opponent in round 7 of the Swiss when we were both then locked for top 8. That matchup is pretty good for me, but I actually had a really competitive game against him in the finals. Looking back at the commentary I've seen of that game specifically, especially given what the commentators were saying, it really didn't look competitive because there were times when pretty much any spell from my side would pretty much lock up either a single or double advance when I had like 5 mana remaining. But me, like looking at my hand in so many of these spots, I had drawn like all of my copies of Small Step Giant Leap. I had like Flamel, Banishing Gate, just things that were not cost effective. So I was just sitting there like stressing over tiny decisions there. Like, is it better to use a removal spell or just play a Flamel out here and hope? That sort of thing. So the finals actually was super competitive. And like looking back at that replay, that was, I think, one of the highest level games of Altered that I've played in general. Both like my own play was pretty good, but my opponent's was as well. The fact that I knew that Ferniko Rico, he's one of the best Tasia players, if not the absolute best at the moment. I was really relying on my own gameplay that he is such a good competitive player because he would read things that I was doing to mean that I had certain cards in my own hand. Many players don't operate on that level. They just play out the cards they have, but he was really trying to read into what I might have. And I think I was able to leverage that in a few cases where I just didn't have those cards, but he had to play around it anyway. So the finals ended up going my way, but that was way closer than it could or even should have been in a lot of cases.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, doing a lot of like commentary casting myself.
Mhm.
I just I wish I could see all the cards in hand a lot of the time, right? But BGA doesn't allow it. It's fine.
I actually have the exact opposite feeling on that, really. I think my favorite thing commentating the game is trying to figure out like lines of play. Why would a player choose to do something like this in a certain situation when you know what they're doing isn't just a mistake? It's just because they're thinking of something. And I think that's a really good advantage when you're playing the game as well, is being able to understand like, okay, my opponent has structured their turn this way. That means they can be working with either of these like 3 things, for example. What can I play around? What can I not play around? And you go from there. And I think that's the sort of thing that really helps. Definitely a deck like Afanas, where you do get so many options and so much flexibility over a game, really being able to read into things like that. I think it's my favorite part of Altered.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it also, I mean, I've found a lot of times, especially for like the in-person events where you can't really see the
Mm.
cards super well, and doing commentary on that, and trying to figure out what the uniques do just by play and what's happening on the board kind of thing. Because like
Yeah.
you do a lot to memorize like different uniques, different possible effects for each unique, and so on
Hmm.
and so forth, right? and being able to interpret that. And I get what you're saying as far as like not seeing the hand and being able to try to figure it out from a competitive aspect and just
Mhm.
increasing game knowledge, which I don't think is a bad thing, especially for commentary folks and those that play simultaneously. I
Yep.
guess my thought as far as like being able to see the hand in general comes from the idea of like commentating towards those that don't have every single thing memorized or as much
Mhm.
as the folks that watch the Discord on an hourly basis kind of thing like I do,
Yep.
and
Yep.
I'm sure you do. Just so that way it helps explanations a little bit to the point of where they don't get completely confused. I guess I'm thinking it from like a long-term perspective of maybe we
Mm.
have a bunch of like viewing audiences at some point for altered events. Maybe not. I don't know. Maybe we stay small forever.
You're
But
right. No, I
but
really
yeah.
hope so as well, and I mean, for me personally, I think this is part of my journey as an altered player, I think is I also myself would like to focus more on commentary than I would as like a competitive player. I wanna be competitive enough to help out my team and to know what I'm doing, know what I'm talking about, but I would really like to be more involved on the commentary side of altered. And so if there are like larger in-person events, I want to be one of those people who's struggling to figure out what the uniques that people are sort of flashing and then try to piece together what they're doing. So I definitely hope that there will be a lot of interest in those sort of events, like large events, and that Equinox will be interested in having, like live streams and commentary and, set up for that sort of thing and ease those logistics a little bit.
For sure. There's a lot of things we can get into with that, but we'll leave that for another day, especially since you like doing commentary as much as I do. Who knows? We might get into a whole little session about that.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, as far as like the top cut itself, you mentioned it a little bit as far as like your
Hmm.
championship game and everything along those lines. And we even had a little conversation about it pre recording here. But did you expect to make it to the top cut, make it as far as you did within the top cut? As far as your preparation that you mentioned, and realistically as the sole undefeated participant within the Swiss.
It's funny if you had asked me 2 days before the event, I actually do think that I felt like I had a really high chance of making top 8 at least. The day of the event, I was stressing out about it. I had like way over prepped as I had mentioned before, I think, for my own sanity. So it was really being able to rely on my teammate Freeloader to tell me like, "Yo, just go for a walk beforehand." And that sort of thing helped out a ton. And so, yeah, I would say after round two, where I was 2-0, I was feeling like, yeah, I can do this. But really, until then, the day of, I was super stressing. Top eight, yeah. Interestingly, it was what I mentioned before. It was as soon as I knew that it was going to be best of one games where I started the first game of the best of one. My opponent played out a pretty cool and reasonably strong unique, and then I realized I could play around it. And from that moment, I was like, okay, I think I can win this whole tournament. Um, and yeah, it really, I think me mentioning before as well, I'm an emotional player. That helps when I have that feeling like, yeah, I got this. I just need to keep playing really clean. Then I was lucky enough as well that my subsequent opponent was also playing Afanas. His top eight match was against another Afanas, so it was an Afanas mirror, and that other Afanas was Yo. I think Yo's configuration would have been actually better against mine for the top four round. As it was, my opponent Tachyfire was on a super cool, like more of a control Afanas style deck, and I think it might have actually been super well tuned for the metagame as well. But in the case of the mirror, where I was already feeling really comfortable playing like a defensive gameplay style that was playing around like what the chances are that I'm going to see certain cards in comparison to my opponent over the rest of the game, he just had more dead cards than I did in his deck, so I think I was very much favored in that game. And then again, as I mentioned before, Teja is a pretty good matchup, so I was reasonably comfortable.
Nice. Cool to get your overall thoughts as far as your run in general. Got a good amount of detail for that. Going into the last question here for you,
Hmm.
do you have any advice to those looking to play competitively and replicate your success? And what are your plans for the future as far as Altered is concerned? Talked a little bit about that, but
Hmm.
can we expect you to go to an in-person event out in Europe potentially if you get the urge to travel a little bit?
Definitely. If there's a big event that I can get to, I definitely intend to. Whether that would be as a player or as someone potentially like helping commentate the event, something like that. I would love to do that. Probably even more at this point than being a player in and of itself. Uh, at least for my own feeling of like, yeah, I could do this as a commentary thing. I think it helps a lot having a tournament on my resume, I guess, like this event. But as far as advice looking or for those looking to play competitively, I think yeah, there's probably a few levels there. I'd say one, the if you're trying to prep for an event specifically, I think the best thing that you can do to give yourself the best shot is to look at the decks that you feel comfortable playing and then look at the decks that you expect to see. If you have an accurate estimation of the decks you expect to see, you should be able then to figure out which decks of yours are going to have the best time overall, and that'll just give you that much more of a leg up. And it's also going to give you a lot of confidence going into the event that you're making the right choices, you're choosing the best things, and it gives you then time, like once you've made those analyses, to really hone in on your your own gameplay with that. You lock into playing Sigismar feeling like it has a really good like matchups across the field. You play the best Sigismar you can for a couple of weeks, get in as many reps as possible. You're going to play a lot better during the actual events. So I'd say try to get together some form of like, whatever you think an analysis of what your metagame will look like. That will definitely help. Repetition and just getting reps in board game arena, super helpful for that. I would highly recommend don't care about your ladder ranking. I play arena. When I play arena, I throw so many of my games, either sometimes accidentally if I'm not paying enough attention, but more often than not, I like to limit test my own decks. I like to intentionally choose a card that I think is wrong in my opening hand so I can sort of counteract my own thought processes sometimes. I think people will lock themselves into linear ways of thinking about the game or certain matchup dynamics. And sometimes, like, testing your own conclusions can be super helpful. And sometimes it'll tell you, okay, no, I was thinking correctly the first time. Like, let's stop doing this. So I think that's super helpful. And also, I would say, like, uniques are incredibly strong, but the way that you should look at them, well, I guess, yeah, it depends. Do you have uniques? I guess would be a first question to ask. If the answer is no, that does not mean you cannot play competitively at all. Um, there were at least multiple decks that I think could easily have spiked this tournament operating with next to zero uniques, as in I think that just replacing rare slots essentially with uniques could have netted certain decks a winning finish. Um, for example, or like most specifically, I would say Kojo and Traced were two examples there. Where just with some like solid but not like crazy expensive or anything unique, so you could definitely get there with those. So I think there's options there. But then other people in general, like content creators and competitive players, have said it's really hard to get like all of the uniques they need for a single deck together or for all of their different decks together. And I sometimes question, I think to myself, like, yeah, maybe that's the point. Maybe you're supposed to have to work with other people who might have access to those and, bring together a team and work with your friends and check out your local community and engage with all the other people who are playing the game and are typically really friendly and often willing to lend you cards and that sort of thing. So if there is something you feel like you really want to be playing and you need to get the reps on it and you want to play those things in a tournament, ask around. I think that sort of thing helps a ton. And then designing your own deck to really match what then you will have access to, that's, yeah, a huge leg up.
For sure. Yeah, I'm a big proponent of what you're talking about as far as like the unique setup and playing
Mhm.
the uniques that you have and figuring out a way to make the uniques you have better within your certain deck in general,
Mhm.
I think is a fun process overall. Like I'm a big proponent even now of the of still playing a little bit of Waru with Robins that have uniques with fun
Oh, yeah.
abilities kind of
Unique
thing.
robins suddenly became almost, like, viable, like, beforehand, it was like, if they were double tax robins, of course, they're good, but
Yeah.
otherwise, do you really want to use a robin slot on a unique? But now, I mean, with the normal Robin Hood ability just not being really a relevant thing anymore, suddenly the unique Robin Hood with, draw 3 cards at dusk's effect are actually pretty solid, that sort of thing. Um, yeah, not that they were, like, bad before, just not quite the same level. But
Yeah,
yeah,
they just
you're
weren't.
you're right there.
Yeah, they just weren't super prioritized
Mhm.
at the time. My current favorite is the Robin Hoods. I think they're at best 5/5s where anytime a character joins the expedition, you draw a card.
Oh,
Um,
those can be crazy. It's funny.
yeah, yeah, those are my favorite at the moment. But yeah,
Nice.
getting past all those, I completely agree with you there. I think there's you can kind of get down on yourself a little bit, especially from a competitive aspect, if you
Mhm.
just try to follow the meta a little bit too much. And there's always merit to finding your own way, especially in a game that allows you to have unique cards in general. So,
Yep.
yep, all right, here's the giveaway question. I need you to comment your favorite card of Trial by Frost and tell me the movie I referenced in the intro of this video. Okay, now back to the interview. Appreciate that. Any shout outs before we wrap things up?
Yeah. Shout out to everyone who is both organizing and playing in online events like that. Shout out to everyone who's playing actively on BGA and enjoying the game. Everyone who's exploring this cool world of a new game like this together and pushing it along. I think that's awesome. My team, AQZ, the Quarantine Zone. You guys, you rock. Let's kill it. 2025. Let's go. Yeah, otherwise, shout out Equinox making this awesome game. I love it. I haven't played a card game that I've liked this much ever. I haven't played any game that I've liked this much ever. Um, so thank you. And yeah, thanks to you for having me on.
No problem. Shout out to Simon for crowning you the winner here in the background that everyone can see. Good job,
He's the
Simon.
man.
There you go. But yeah, everyone watching, we have the Kelon guy, the champion of the AWOL Season 1 Invitational. Thanks for stopping by. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you in play on the next day.
Take care.